Okay, this afternoon I want to talk about war in our world and really give some attention to differences between how we learn about Ukraine and Palestine. So let me begin with a quotation from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In his Beyond Vietnam speech, he spoke from the big frame to call for a revolution of values based on love. This call for a worldwide fellowship that lifts neighborly concern beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation is in reality a call for an all-embracing and unconditional love for all humankind. When I speak of love, I am not speaking of some sentimental and weak response. I am not speaking of that force, which is just emotional bosh. I am speaking of that force from which all of the great religions have seen as the supreme unifying principle of life. Love is somehow the key that unlocks the door that leads to ultimate reality. This Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist belief about ultimate reality is beautifully summed up in the first epistle of St. John. Let us love one another, for love is of God. And everyone that loveth is born of God and knoweth God. He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. If we love one another, God dwelleth in us, and God's love is perfected in us. Let us hope that this spirit will become the order of the day. And there I end my quotation. Today, I want just to discuss media coverage of occupation of one people's land by another people. So let me start with some history of Palestine. May 15th this year will mark the 75th anniversary of Al-Nakba, or the Palestinian experience of dispossession and loss of their homeland. Having secured the support of the British government for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine on May 14, 1948, as soon as the British mandate expired, Zionist forces declared the establishment of the State of Israel, triggering the first Arab-Israeli War. Zionist military forces expelled at least 750,000 Palestinians from their homes and lands and captured 78% of historic Palestine. The remaining 22% was divided into what are now the occupied West Bank and the besieged Gaza Strip. The fighting continued until January 1949, when an armistice agreement between Israel and Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria was forged. Israel occupied the rest of Palestine during the June 1967 war. Israel's military occupation of Palestine remains at the core of this decades-long conflict that continues to shape every part of Palestinians' lives. Now, I want to make sure that we understand that the current state or nation of Israel is not the Israel of the Bible. When I talk about Jewish people, I am not talking about adherence to the Jewish faith. I am referring to people who are recognized as having Jewish heritage and who are receiving preferential treatment by the government of the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel is located in the area of the world that is the seat of Judaism and Christianity, but the nation of Israel is not a religious state. Between 1947 and 1949, Zionist military forces destroyed at least 530 Palestinian villages. There are currently about 6 million registered Palestinian refugees living in at least 58 camps located throughout Palestine and neighboring countries. According to international law, refugees have the right to return to their homes and property from which they have been displaced. Many Palestinians still have hope of returning to Palestine. The plight of Palestinian refugees is the longest unresolved refugee problem in the world. If people living as refugees on their own land looks familiar, it should. Here in the United States, we are living and working mostly on indigenous land occupied by people who immigrated from Europe. The original people have been relegated to refugee camps, which we call reservations. We seldom ask or hear about the feelings of the Native Americans, but let us consider their perspective. Having your lands occupied, your families killed, and then your lands slowly stolen by people who think some God gave it to them, and then being labeled as terrorists for resisting the occupation and fighting back. Palestine, we understand. And I dare say that Indigenous Americans are also saying, Ukraine, we understand. Just as we seldom give thought to the displaced Indigenous people in North America, we seldom consider the displacement of people in Palestine. However, we are paying a lot of attention to the displacement of people in Ukraine as their land is being destroyed by Russia. As of this past Wednesday, according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, there are nearly 8 million refugees from Ukraine recorded across Europe, with about 5 million of them registered for temporary protection. And this map shows that about 1.5 million of them are in Poland, and another 500,000 are in the Czech Republic. About 1 million have registered for temporary protection in Germany. And we need to be mindful that if Ukrainians are not successful in protecting their land, they too will be killed off by ethnic cleansing, and the survivors will likely live in refugee camps in their own land. I just want to add one more piece to Reverend Harlan's statement of dilemma as we consider the Ukrainian situation. Reverend Harlan gave a thorough presentation on the history of Ukraine's struggle for freedom to be its own nation on its own land. So I'm not going to reprise that. I just want to point out, though, that in late 2021, as he showed, Russia began a military buildup along its border with Ukraine. And in February 22, Russia started an invasion of Ukraine that is still ongoing nearly 11 months later. And I just wanted to point out 4 regions of Ukraine that Russia was annexing at the end of this past September. Yesterday, I received a current map of Israeli settlements in Palestine. There's a lot of information in this Peace Now map, so I just want to highlight some of the information. The area of Ukraine is 233,000 square miles, which is about 5 times the size of Ohio. Palestine is 1/100th the size of Ukraine, about 2,300 square miles. Palestine is actually smaller than Medina, Portage, Cuyahoga, and Summit counties combined. Now, the Israeli nation has taken ownership of land, and 99.76% of the state land in the West Bank went to Israeli Jews, and less than 0.25%, that's 0.24%, went to Palestinians. This is how the state discriminates against Palestinians in the West Bank. Israel, which has controlled the land for over 50 years now, allocated land virtually exclusively for the settlement enterprise, while strenuously avoiding allocations to Palestinians. Land is one of the most precious public resources. Publicly and purposely allocating land to just one people at the expense of another in the same territory and under the same administration is one of the distinct characteristics of apartheid. So we wonder, with these settlements, and this is housing built specifically for people to move to the land they are calling Israel. We wonder, how do these settlements hinder peace? So I'm just going to talk about 3 of their plans. Ariel is one of the settlements, and it not only blocks Palestinian development in the West Bank, but it would also become an isolated Israeli town in the heart of a Palestinian state. There's another plan called the E1 plan that will build thousands of housing units near Ma'aid Adumim, and it represents a fatal blow to the 2-state solution because it would break the north-south contiguity of Palestinian territory and prevent the development of the Palestinian metropolitan area that includes Ramallah. I'm trying to get my pointer to work. Ramallah up here to the north, East Jerusalem. This gray area is the Israeli part of Jerusalem, but over here on the east is East Jerusalem, which is partially controlled by Palestinians, and Bethlehem, which is also in Palestinian territory. So the development of the E1 plan would really take up a lot of this area and divide this northern part of Palestine from the southern part. Another plan is to develop thousands of housing units in Nahla, which would double the size of the Efrat settlement, blocking any potential Palestinian development south of Bethlehem and severing Route 60, which would disconnect the southern West Bank from Bethlehem and beyond. And this is very similar to the 1950s and 1960s, when the United States interstate highways were built to divide and destroy Black communities. But in this case, the plan is to disrupt the highway by building houses. Same effect. So we hear about the bombing of Ukraine, and the media covers the outrage at the attacks on Ukrainian citizens. There is relative silence about the systematic discrimination, military checkpoints, illegal settlements, home demolitions, raids and arrests, and assaults on Gaza, which some people describe as the largest open-air prison in the world. As we watch the coverage of the attacks on Ukraine, we are outraged by pictures of the destruction of civilian homes or workplaces. We are particularly upset by pictures of innocent children in the wreckage. And the pictures or videos of actual bombings showing the fire and smoke are shocking. The European and American media, now celebrating Ukrainian civilians building Molotov cocktails, are the same media that condemn Palestinian children for even picking up stones to resist military occupation. European and American reporters are universally supporting Ukrainian resistance to the Russian invasion. They are lauding boycott measures such as American citizens pouring vodka down sewer grates, airlines canceling flights, and athletic associations canceling games. They press officials on why the US and Europe have not adopted stiffer sanctions against Russia. But for anyone who follows Palestinians, what leaps out is the obvious hypocrisy of official Western attitudes toward Palestinian resistance to occupations. In that case, there is a long tradition of our media and politicians condemning the Palestinian boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign. The good news is that many observers are now pointing out the contradiction. And in spite of recognizing the hypocrisy in coverage, we hear nothing about the Palestinians who are still being killed. This picture is from last Saturday's news reported by the Palestine Freedom Project of seven Palestinian men killed in Israel during the first few days of 2023. At the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, some journalists addressed the parallels between Israel and Russia as the invasion of Ukraine started. They wrote that Israel has no right to criticize Russia, a country that has imposed violent occupation for more than 50 years, cannot criticize a 3-day occupation. Russia's justification for an invasion, the propaganda and the lies seem to be taken from Israel's playbook every time it invaded Gaza or Lebanon. Israel always feels threatened, just like Russia, and both deny the national rights of the people whose land they occupy. The demonization is also similar. The Ukrainians are called Nazis, the Palestinians are called terrorists, and these are both propaganda lies. So I intentionally did not identify the pictures I showed earlier. I talked about our shock at bombing images in Ukraine, but all these pictures I've shown you are actually of Palestine. The bombing of global media offices in Gaza caused a stir, while few people noted the Palestinian journalists left to work with targets on their backs. These journalists are standing in the rubble of Al-Ja'i Tower, which housed several media outlets, including the Associated Press and Al Jazeera, after it was targeted by Israeli airstrikes and collapsed in Gaza City on May 14th, 2021. A research report about Gaza warns that striking military targets in non-military environments has devastating impacts on the civilian populace. Now, Israel has made a habit out of bombing Gaza during Ramadan. In a world filled with unpredictable and unforeseeable events, Israeli military attacks on the Gaza Strip during Ramadan has reached the level of predictable certainty, emphasizing the state's ongoing cruelty toward the Palestinians. In this July 22nd, 2014 file photo, smoke and fire from a devastating Israeli airstrike rise over Gaza City during the holy month of Ramadan. Israeli military attacks on Gaza at the start of Ramadan in 2022 represent a continuation of the unnecessary cruelty of the Israeli government. This is a photograph of a Palestinian family in Gaza breaking their Ramadan fast outside their home, destroyed by Israeli warplanes in 2021. Now, just last month, we heard that after Russia bombed the power plants and left many Ukrainians without electricity, some decided to celebrate Christmas on December 25th instead of January 7th, the date of the celebration of Eastern Orthodox Christmas in Russia. For Palestinians, the month of Ramadan also delivers a traumatic reminder of family members and friends lost and injured during the Israeli military's most recent invasion of Gaza. The attack that was launched at the start of the Muslim Holy Month in 2014 resulted in the death of more than 2,200 Palestinians, along with permanent injuries inflicted upon more than 10,000 others over 53 bloody days. The damage enacted upon Gaza's infrastructure and economy was just as devastating, leaving more than 10,000 homes completely destroyed, along with structural damage to another 100,000. Gaza's only power station was struck by Israeli missiles, as were 24 medical facilities, while more than 400 businesses were completely wiped out. Though shocking, the extreme devastation was also to be expected, given the Israeli military boast that 390,000 tank shells, 34,000 artillery shells, and 4.8 million bullets were supplied during the fighting. This arsenal of weaponry represents almost 2 bullets for every Palestinian in Gaza, and the ordnance power of 13,000 tons of TNT, the equivalent of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. It has left Gaza completely unlivable, according to the United Nations. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, also known as BDS, is in full swing in the United States. The Biden administration is implementing it as Republican members of Congress, and I'm talking about the 117th Congress, ask for even harsher sanctions. Most Americans approve of this policy and are eager to do their part by individually boycotting products and seeking out alternatives. This is not fanciful thinking. This has been reality since Russia's February invasion of Ukraine. The Western response was swift, as the European Union, United States, United Kingdom, and Canada imposed sweeping sanctions on Russia, targeting President Vladimir Putin and his cronies, along with Russia's largest financial institutions and tech companies. Despite unfounded accusations of anti-Semitism, the Palestinian call for BDS does not advocate a blanket boycott of Jewish-owned businesses, but rather a careful elaboration of why certain companies are subject to boycott, while others are BDS compliant, regardless of the identity of their owners. The arguments used by those who support boycotting Russia echo those articulated by people who support Palestinian rights. In 2018, the East Ohio Annual Conference approved a resolution on protecting the rights to peacefully address injustice through boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, which calls for our conference to oppose any state or federal legislation that seeks to redirect the rights to address injustice. The goal of the resolution was to educate both lawmakers and United Methodists throughout our congregations about the right to use this form of peaceful protest, which proved effective in ending South African apartheid and is now being used in attempts to end the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Despite our best efforts in the East Ohio Annual Conference, Ohio has twice passed anti-BDS legislation. SB 135 amends Ohio's 2017 anti-boycott law, House Bill 476, which prohibits state contracts with companies, including sole proprietors, that boycott any jurisdiction with which Ohio can enjoy open trade, including Israel and the territories it occupies. And that phrase, including Israel and the territories it occupies, is written into the law, specifically saying that BDS against Israel is considered illegal in Ohio. The amendment expands the scope of the law to include state institutions of higher education. And in addition, this bill requires state schools to make free expression policies, including anti-boycott law, available to all students, and to create formal processes to adjudicate complaints of free speech violation by university employees. The bill, which does not encourage free speech for peaceful protest, went into effect in July last year. And I want to close my presentation with a personal note. This is a picture of my friend Iyad Bernat, who is a leader like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Iyad has been leading weekly peaceful protests in the small town of Bile'in in Palestine for about 2 decades. He is pictured here holding the award he received from the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict in 2015. During 2022, the Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, broke into Iyad's house 4 times and destroyed as much as they could of his furniture and possessions. They arrested 2 of his sons, and those 2 sons are being held without charge or trial. When I was in Palestine in 2012, I visited Iyad's home and sat on lovely furniture in this living room as he described the importance of nonviolent resistance. That night, the women in my delegation slept in the guest rooms of Iyad's brother next door to Iyad's house. His brother kept watch in the living room to make sure that we were safe. The men in our delegation spent the night on the roof of Iyad's house, taking turns watching to warn if the IDF approached his home. And I can tell you, it's really quite a shock after you've been someplace and sat and listened to a peace lover to see that that very room was totally destroyed. And this is what the IDF did to Iyad's youngest son's bedroom. When they destroyed Iyad's belongings, the IDF made sure to destroy the award that he had received. The award reads, in recognition, Iyad Bernat, June 10th, 2015. The James Lawson Award for Outstanding Achievement in the Practice of Nonviolent Action. James Lawson was the leading strategist in the civil rights movement in the United States and was called the mind of the movement by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Iyad Bernat has organized people and courageously engaged in civil resistance in Palestine for over a decade and educated people around the world about nonviolent struggle. And some of you might be familiar with the Reverend James M. Lawson Jr., who is a prominent United Methodist pastor. He is currently 94 years old. I was privileged to meet him a few years ago. He got his undergraduate degree in sociology from Baldwin Wallace College and studied at the Oberlin Graduate School of Theology before moving south when Reverend King invited him to become a trainer of nonviolent activists. So, what do we do going forward? I recommend following the call to come and see, go and tell by taking a responsible Holy Land tour and by reading and endorsing the Palestinian Christian Cry for Hope. Thank you.
Well, I'll have to share a bit of my story in terms of this context. For years, I knew nothing about the Palestinians. Didn't hear much about them, didn't know anyone. And I grew up in a culture at a time when the Holocaust had been exposed and many people were, for whatever reasons in America, some out of sympathy, some out of guilt, because of the US's own practices and policies during when the Holocaust was going on and we turned people away. So I was prejudiced towards Israel, towards protecting Israel, until I learned, I think the conversion for me was Jimmy Carter's book, which is quite old now, but to his credit, Jimmy Carter also had such standing and presence of respect that when I read that book, it opened my eyes. I said, it's quite old now, but it changed my perspective, and I began to question the sympathies that I had developed. His details were very specific. They were very moving, both emotionally and intellectually. So they were persuasive as well as being respectful, believable, etc. And that was the beginning of my journey to begin to question, why has the United States been so silent about Palestine? And so, well, first of all, silent about Palestine. And I do think it is rooted in not necessarily the guilt, but certainly the presence of Israelis in the United States, Jewish people in the United States. Some of that dating back to the great world sympathy of creating the state of the modern state of Israel. But again, the visibility of Jewish leaders in the United States who are very, they have a presence. We know their stories. We know the Holocaust. at the same time that we know very little, very, very little, as little as we knew about the Ukrainian people and their struggles, we probably knew even less about who these Palestinians were, what their struggles had been, what their rights were that had been violated. So I think those things, that doesn't justify, but for me, I have to understand, how did we get to this place that we were, what appears to be a completely societal prejudice, which then has trickled down into the individuals within society. So it's only when people like Dr. Martha Banks goes to Palestine and sees these things and comes home and tries to tell us firsthand, as she has been doing for the last several conferences, probably for the last 10 years, she's quietly, persistently shown us evidence that we have, many of us, and I fully admit I'm one of them, neither knew what was going on in Palestine nor paid attention to it. The society has promoted that in the sense that we don't get the media coverage. We don't see the presence of Palestinian people. And the sympathies, both to the Holocaust and to the presence of Jewish leaders in our community, it's easy in a society that does not do much investigative reporting on our own individual basis. It was easier for us to perpetuate a misunderstanding of the Israelis as being correct in needing land, etc., and to ignore what was the absolute human rights violations that were occurring in Palestine. As we're meeting today, on my Facebook, I don't know, I didn't ask for this group to send me anything, combat anti-Semitism. 1,116 entries around the world of countries, cities, universities, and sports teams that have adopted the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, working to get against the anti-Semitism, a definition of anti-Semitism, adoptions and endorsements. How many other people will read this and not think that there's another side to the story? Okay. So yes, not only do I respect everything that Martha has shown us today, Dr. Martha has shown us today. And I hope that we can understand within ourselves how we got to the point, many of us here, to need to be informed about what is happening in Palestine, what has happened to the Palestinians, how they have been treated unjustly by our own country, our own leaders, and by the people, by many, at least, people in America who do not know their story. Thank you, Martha.
And I want to thank you, Dr. Carol, and we need to get your title up there and your name too. I want to thank you, and I'd like to just take off a little bit from where you were and talk about Dr. Harlan's theological dilemma.
Yes, the doctor.
I want to
Not
talk
yet.
about your theological dilemma, because one of the reasons that we don't know very much about Palestine has to do not with Jewish Zionism, but with Christian Zionism.
Yes.
Christian Zionism is, in my opinion, one of the largest acts of anti-Semitism that the world has ever experienced, because the goal of Christian Zionism is to get the Jewish people, and I'm talking about Jewish faith, get the Jewish faith-believing people all in one place to hurry the return of Christ. where the Jewish people will all be destroyed and Christ shall rise with the Christians. And that's why there is so much money being pumped into the nation of Israel by the United States. It's at the hands of the Christian Zionists. And I see Joy nodding and clapping. Yeah.
This is just one of those things that kind of blows my mind. It's like one of the great bait and switches that we manage in our sort of religio-political culture. Is that this whole notion of Christian eschatology is to sacrifice the entire Jewish population on the altar of our perception of winning religious victory, which is, it's just gross, and yet it gets completely subsumed into the narrative. So I thank you for just stating it succinctly and forthrightly, and it needs to be said in a lot more places that that's what it is.
I'd like to
As I was trying to put together, I'm sorry, go ahead, Harlan.
Oh, and I was just going to say that, I mean, I think the major thing that I always go back to is also the question of race and the construction of race in this country, in the sense that at some point, you know, I know for much of our history, I think most or many sort of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants would have thought of Jewish people as racially othered. I think that was a big part of like the 19th century understanding. And at some point that changed. Same is probably true for the Irish at one point, but we make people white eventually if we want to, for whatever reason. And for some reason, we decided to expand the definition of whiteness to include Jewish people, but not to include other Semitic cultures from the Middle East, and in particular, Arab people, people of Arabic descent. That's right. So, you know, and that's where I go to. My question internally also has been about the Ukrainian refugee crisis versus the Syrian refugee crisis, which is very similar in the sense that in this century, a massive war breaks out and millions of people are displaced. And Europe was thrown for a loop by having large numbers of Syrian migrants, and we're trying to stop the flow of Syrian migrants. But the Ukrainians have gotten different treatment. And again, even though we may not know the Ukrainian history, I think it's, again, that racism at play to say, we're far more willing to tolerate white Christian refugees than people we consider racially and religiously othered. I'm always careful to point out it doesn't mean we shouldn't help the Ukrainians, but it just means we should have done better for the Syrians, and we should still do better for the Syrians, and as you point out, the Palestinians as well. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's a big distinction in your media coverage. You were alluding to it, that yeah, these people, the same photos of a child playing in wreckage, but if the child's skin is slightly darker in color, it just doesn't make the front page. So
and I just wanted to illustrate the point you just made, and I'm going to go back to the slideshow for just a second. If it will advance. I showed you the picture of Iyad. I've seen Iyad several different times of year, and he's very light-skinned. This picture would have been taken in June when he received the award. And so he was darker because, as I say, he leads these outdoor protests every week. And so he was tanned. But he came here to Ohio, I want to say it was 2017, might have been 2016, but he was here and he spent several days in Alliance. He stayed overnight in Alliance, and he presented in Alliance and in Youngstown after he had presented here in Akron. And while he was in Alliance, he was able to go to do some shopping to take home some souvenirs for his wife and kids. And I dare say that in alliance where there is extreme racial prejudice against African Americans, my guess is that Iyad had some of the most carefree days of his life because people did not see him as anybody except a white guy with a tan. People didn't know who he was. He was not bothered. He was able to freely shop, walk around without any fear. That's the United States.
Well, and conversely to that, after 9/11, I had a coworker who was Jewish, but looked sort of Arabian and had a lot of trouble going through airports because they thought he was one of those people. And we talked about it a lot. So
there were people, there was a man, I think it was in Detroit, who was killed, who was he had no affiliation with the ethnicities that would have been harmed, but because someone perceived that he could have been part of that kind of society, he was murdered. So, but that was, as I looked forward to the programming today, I knew I wanted Harlan here because I wanted to hear and I am not the only one who wanted to hear what he had to say. Reverend Dr. Jack Sullivan presented at Black Theologian Day. He presented at the Ohio Justice Policy Center, where he did speak. That was the first time I'd heard him speak about the loss of his younger sister who was murdered, and her murderer had never been found. But I don't know if that is the impetus. We talk about stories, and some of us, more and more, I'm convinced that it is the stories that educate many of us. We need studies, we need the data, but data does not touch our hearts, or it may help us decide to buy this product rather than that product, but it doesn't teach us or impact us with the stories of the individuals who have experienced things. So the other piece that we talked about, considered putting in the program today, was Christian nationalism. And that is the future. That is the future discussion, because we are on the rise of Christian nationalism in the world is evident. In many ways, that may very well be a support to Putin. I don't know that we can say that was not necessarily his logic, or may have had nothing to do with what his press to invade Ukraine. But certainly it's alive and well. Italy, Brazil, we've got some other parts of the world where this is more and more and more evident. And the dialogue and the evidence of it rising in the United States is increasingly frightening. So that was the other topic I did create, and there have been several very, very informative programs and pieces, PBS and some others. And there's one particular one that just came out the other day, and it will be on the last slide. As a forerunner, I'm looking ahead to say this may be one of the next pieces that the Methodist Federation for Social Action will address, hopefully later this year. The linkage, and I know it's very, very hard for an awful lot of people who identify as Christian. They think of it as not being a problem. It's like, well, of course, we're Christian. What's wrong with that? And we believe in our country. What's wrong with that? And of course, the ideology behind it is the same kind, not the same, but the same kind of meism as supreme. God favored me, that created what some people call the original sin in America. How it was okay to disseminate the tribes, to murder off those Indians. It led to slavery. No, sorry, that's not exactly true. There are lots of other factors that led to slavery, but it supported. It was a primary support to keep people enslaved. And there are many, many other instances of it that are bubbling up now. So if there are no further discussions, I'll leave it open for a couple more minutes, and then if not, we'll move towards the final pieces of the slides. Joy, it's been a wonderful day. Thank you for your time, your attention, your commitment. Thank you for being here. Sandy. Hi.
You're still muted.
Sandy, if you go to the right-hand
Gotcha.
corner, there you go.
There you go.
Gotcha. Okay. Two very simple things, and yeah, I think perhaps they'll give you some food for thought. Harlan, you mentioned the fact that you get troubled with yourself when you get angry because you're not living up to your own thing, and then you want to change and develop a total kind of thing that's going to always stand you in good stead. I've given up on that. I get angry. I shout at the television. I shout at the radio, say, you know, you're crazy. And then I realize what I'm doing, and I stop and I think about it. And I think, okay, how can I say this to myself in ways that are helpful so that the next time that I talk with someone else, I can be articulate and I can be helpful to them. So 1/3. Then another little piece that I remember hearing in somebody else's speech, that someone gave all of these same terrible things that are going on in the world and how frustrated we are with that. And this one woman sat there and listened to all of this and raised her hand and said, I know this is a terrible problem and you are working hard at trying to solve it. Would it help if I baked a cake? Well, now for many people that seems so absurd, but yet how many times don't we solve the problems that we have with each other over a piece of cake? And isn't that the first thing we think about at a time of death? Take some food. And I think of all of the food that the United Methodist women, I think, are particularly, who are no longer named that, and I've forgotten what the new name is. But the fact that we can do those simple kinds of things, that maybe that's the hope for changing the world. Because when we get to be part of something that is huge, we lose touch with reality and we lose touch with each other. Yeah. And I remember finally putting back together a friendship that had been important to me, and did that through the open window of my car with this woman who was a neighbor, and reaching through the window and crying into each other's arms, and knowing that even though that we hadn't solved every piece of that, but we had been able to touch each other. So just, you know, that to me is theology. Harlan, wherever you are on my screen.